On June 12, 2026, the United States Treasury Department issued what it called the most comprehensive sanctions package in the history of American foreign policy. The Treasury Secretary stood at the podium and said, and this is a direct quote, Iran's ability to sell oil on the global market is finished. We have closed every door. Hold on to that sentence, because within 72 hours of that statement, satellite tracking data reviewed by Reuters and the Financial Times showed 43 tankers carrying Iranian crude moving unimpeded through the Gulf of Oman toward ports in Russia, China, and the UAE. 43, not 3, not 12, 43 tankers moving in broad daylight. These two things cannot both be true. Either the most comprehensive sanctions package in the history of American foreign policy actually works, or 43 tankers full of Iranian oil are sailing freely across the world's most watched waterway. Today, that is the question this analysis is going to answer for you. Right now, CNN is asking whether the sanctions are strong enough. Fox News is asking whether Iran will blink. The BBC is asking whether European allies will hold the line. These are all wrong questions. They are looking at the surface of the water while the entire ocean floor has shifted beneath them. The right question is this: when exactly did Iran stop needing Washington's permission to sell its oil? Because the answer to that question changes everything. It means the leverage that American policymakers believe they hold, the leverage that has been the foundation of Western Iran policy for 2 decades, no longer exists in the form anyone in Washington thinks it does. In the next 25 minutes, this analysis is going to show you the architecture of what Iran has built, why it is effectively sanctions-proof in its current form, and who is quietly collecting the rent on this new system without firing a single shot. To understand this, you need one framework. Call it the parallel pipeline doctrine. It is not new, it is not uniquely Iranian, but Iran has executed it more completely than any sanctioned state in modern history, and understanding it from first principles is the only way to see what is actually happening. Here's the simplest way to think about it. Imagine you run a small shop in a neighborhood, and the most powerful family on the block tells every bank in town not to process your payments. At first, this works. You cannot pay your suppliers, your inventory dries up, you look finished. But then you do something the powerful family did not anticipate. You stop using banks entirely. You build a second parallel financial system using cash, barter, cryptocurrency, and a network of middlemen who are themselves outside the powerful family's reach. You find suppliers in different neighborhoods who do not care about the powerful family's rules. You reroute every transaction through a chain of entities so long and so opaque that no single choke point can shut you down. You are not beating the powerful family at their game. You are playing an entirely different game on an entirely different board. That is the parallel pipeline doctrine, and Iran has been building it quietly and methodically since at least 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. The historical anchor for this is worth understanding. In the 1960s and 1970s, economists studying the Soviet bloc developed what they called shadow economy theory. They observed that every time a centrally planned system created artificial scarcity through price controls or embargoes, informal parallel markets emerged to fill the gap. These shadow markets were not accidents. They were not signs of system failure. They were rational, self-organizing responses to artificial constraint. The more tightly you tried to suppress them, the more sophisticated they became. North Korea, as this analysis has discussed before, ran the same playbook. Sanctions did not stop North Korea's weapons program. They forced North Korea to build a financial architecture so decentralized and so deeply embedded in legitimate trade flows that it became nearly impossible to surgically remove. Iran watched that process. Iran took notes. Now, here is the evidence. There are 5 structural pillars of Iran's rewired oil supply chain, and each one deserves to be understood on its own terms. Pillar number 1 is the Russia corridor, and this is the centerpiece of everything. Since 2022, and this is documented extensively in reporting by Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, Iran and Russia have built what analysts now call the North-South Transport Corridor. It runs from Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf, up through Iranian territory, across the Caspian Sea, and into Russian distribution networks that then feed into both domestic Russian consumption and onward export through routes that bypass bypass Western financial infrastructure entirely. The volume numbers are striking. According to tracking data cited by Bloomberg in early 2026, Iran-Russia bilateral trade more than tripled between 2021 and 2025. A significant portion of that trade is oil moving northward and Russian military and industrial components moving southward. The corridor itself is not a secret. It has been reported. It has been tracked. What has not been widely understood is that it has reached sufficient volume and redundancy that it no longer requires any element of Western financial infrastructure to function. It runs on Russian payment systems, on barter arrangements denominated in rials and rubles, and on a network of trading companies registered in jurisdictions from the UAE to Turkey to Kazakhstan that are technically outside both American and European sanctions jurisdiction. Okay? Does that make sense? The corridor is not a loophole. It is a parallel highway. Pillar number 2 is the ghost fleet, and here the numbers are genuinely remarkable. According to research by Windward, a maritime analytics firm, and corroborated by Lloyd's List Intelligence, Iran now operates or has access to a fleet of between 250 and 300 vessels that routinely engage in what the industry calls dark shipping. These are ships that disable their automatic identification system transponders, transfer cargo at sea between vessels rather than at formal ports, and are often registered under multiple flags in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. 300, not 30. 300 vessels. To put that in context, the entire United States Navy has approximately 290 commissioned ships. Iran's shadow fleet is approximately the same size as the United States Navy. This is not a small workaround. This is industrial-scale logistics infrastructure. And here's the critical point. Many of these vessels are not Iranian-flagged or Iranian-owned in any traceable legal sense. They are owned through chains of shell companies in places like the Marshall Islands, Liberia, and Panama, which means sanctioning them individually is a legal and administrative exercise that takes months per vessel, during which time the vessel has already been replaced in the network by another. Pillar number 3 is the UAE connection, and this is where the architecture gets subtle. The United Arab Emirates, specifically Dubai, has functioned for decades as a re-export hub for goods moving in and out of Iran in defiance of sanctions. This is documented. It is well known. What is less understood is that the scale and sophistication of this conduit has grown dramatically since 2022. According to analysis by the Atlantic Council and reporting by Reuters in 2025, Iranian oil regularly reaches international markets with its origin obscured through a process of ship-to-ship transfer in international waters, relabeling at UAE ports, and then sale as UAE origin, crude or blended crude, to buyers in Asia who in many documented cases are aware of the true origin but have legal and political cover to deny knowledge of it. The buyers are not naive. They are not being deceived. They are participating in a system that gives everyone involved plausible deniability. Think of it this way. If you want to move water from one side of a wall to the other, and there is a crack in the wall, you do not need to break the wall down. You just need a pump, a bucket, and someone on both sides who agrees to look the other way. The UAE is the crack in the wall. Dubai is the bucket, and the pump has been running at increasing capacity for 4 years. Pillar number 4 is the Chinese demand anchor, and this is perhaps the most structurally important element of everything. Just China's now, according to data from the International Energy Agency and independent tracking firms, including KP and Vortexa, the single largest buyer of Iranian oil on the planet. Estimates vary, but figures cited in 2025 and early 2026 consistently put Chinese purchases of Iranian crude at between 1 and 1.4 million barrels per day. At $60 per barrel, that is somewhere between $60 and $84 million per day flowing into Iran from China alone. Not per month, per day. And here is what makes this structurally irreversible in the short term. China does not pay for this oil in dollars. It pays through a combination of yuan-denominated accounts at Chinese state banks, commodity swaps, and barter arrangements involving Chinese manufactured goods, construction equipment, and consumer electronics. None of those transactions touch the SWIFT financial messaging system. None of them require American correspondent banking relationships. The the perspective of American sanctions architecture, essentially invisible. The sanctions were designed in an era when dollar primacy and SWIFT membership were the choke points through which all significant global commerce flowed. That era is not over, but the percentage of global trade that flows through those choke points has been declining, and Iran has positioned itself almost entirely outside of them. Pillar number 5 is the insurance and certification bypass, and this one is technical but important. For decades, one of the most effective tools of Western sanctions on oil exporters has been insurance. Virtually all large commercial tankers require what is called protection and indemnity insurance, which covers liability for oil spills, cargo damage, and maritime incidents. The vast majority of this insurance has historically been provided by the international group of P&I clubs, a consortium of 13 mutual insurers based primarily in the United Kingdom and Norway. If those insurers refuse to cover tankers carrying Iranian oil, the legitimate shipping industry cannot move that oil. This was a genuinely effective choke point for many years. But here's what has changed. Russia, following its own sanctions exposure after 2022, developed domestic P&I insurance alternatives through Russian state-backed insurers. Iran has entered into mutual recognition arrangements with those Russian insurers. Additionally, a network of smaller, non-Western insurers, some based in the UAE, some in China, some in India, now provides coverage for the shadow fleet specifically. The choke point still exists, but pipelines have been built around it. Micro reset, okay? This is not a small technical footnote. This is a fundamental change in the plumbing of global energy finance. Now let the strongest possible argument against this analysis be considered, because intellectual honesty demands it. The case for continued American leverage goes something like this. Iran's parallel supply chain is real, but it is inefficient, costly, and fragile. Iran sells its oil at a significant discount, reportedly between $10 and $20 per barrel below Brent crude benchmark prices, according to reporting by the Financial Times. That discount represents tens of billions of dollars per year in lost revenue. Iran cannot access advanced Western technology for its oil fields, which are aging and suffering from declining production efficiency, and the shadow fleet, while large, operates at higher cost and higher risk than legitimate shipping. The argument is that maximum pressure, sustained and expanded, eventually makes the cost of maintaining the parallel pipeline so high that Iran must return to the negotiating table. That is a serious argument. It has serious people behind it. But here's what it cannot explain. Iran's oil exports have not collapsed under maximum pressure. They have grown. According to tracking data from Kepler and Vortexa, cited in 2025 and 2026 reporting, Iranian oil exports reached their highest levels since before the original 2018 sanctions reimposition in late 2025, somewhere between 2 and 2.4 million barrels per day. The parallel pipeline, despite its inefficiencies, despite its cost discount, is moving more oil than the pre-sanctioned pipeline was at certain points in the last decade. The discount is a cost of doing business. It is not a fatal wound. And crucially, the entities absorbing that discount, Russia, China, and their networks of intermediaries, have structural incentives to keep absorbing it. For Russia, the corridor is about strategic alignment and mutual sanctions evasion. For China, the discount is literally a subsidy to Chinese industry. Cheap oil for Chinese factories is not a problem China wants to solve. It is a benefit China wants to preserve. Bring it together now. What this analysis has shown is that Iran's oil supply chain no longer runs through any choke point that American policy can effectively control. The Russia corridor provides overland redundancy. The Ghost Fleet provides maritime redundancy. The UAE conduit provides transactional obscurity. Chinese demand provides structural financial insulation, and the alternative insurance and payment infrastructure provides the legal and logistical scaffolding that allows all of it to function at scale. The sanctions are not without effect. They impose real costs. They create real inefficiencies. But the architecture that those sanctions were designed to exploit, the assumption that Iran must pass through dollar-denominated, SWIFT-connected, Western-insured global commerce to sell its oil, that assumption is no longer valid. When the Treasury Secretary says every door is closed, she is describing a building that Iran no longer lives in. And now, the actor that no one is talking about. There is a third player in this architecture who has not been mentioned yet, who has not fired a shot, who is not subject to any of these sanctions, and who is quietly collecting a structural rent on every barrel of Iranian oil that moves through this parallel system. That player is Beijing. Think about what China has actually built here. China is buying Iranian oil at a discount of $10 to $20 per barrel. China is the anchor buyer that makes the entire parallel pipeline economically viable. Without Chinese demand, the system collapses. And because Chinese demand is the foundation, China has extraordinary leverage over Iran, leverage that does not need to be exercised loudly or publicly. Every time Washington tightens sanctions and Iran becomes more dependent on the Chinese demand anchor, China's negotiating position with Tehran strengthens. Iran cannot afford to alienate its only major buyer. China knows this. Beijing is not just reading the board. Beijing is the board. Every American sanction that drives Iran deeper into Chinese dependency is, in structural terms, a gift to Beijing. The patient giant is not collecting the winnings. The patient giant built the casino. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch the tanker tracking data. Specifically, watch whether the 43 vessels identified in this week's satellite imagery maintain their routes or whether any show course changes consistent with a response to the new sanctions package. If they maintain course, that is confirmation that the parallel pipeline is operating with confidence. Second, watch the yuan-real exchange rate on the unofficial Iranian market. Any significant movement in that rate in the days following the sanctions announcement would signal that the Chinese payment channel is being stressed or adjusted. The unofficial rate is reported by sources including Iran International and the Financial Tribune and is a sensitive indicator of the health of the China-Iran financial corridor. Third, watch Moscow. Specifically, watch whether any Russian official or state media outlet makes a public statement in defense of the North-South transport corridor. A Russian statement defending the corridor in the wake of American sanctions would signal that Moscow is publicly committing to the partnership's continuity, which has significant implications for whether secondary sanctions on Russian entities involved in the corridor are viable. Here's the homework. Go and find 2 documents and put them side by side. The first is the United States Treasury Department's most recent Iran sanctions enforcement action, which is publicly available on the Treasury website. The KPLR or Vortexa monthly Iran oil export tracker, which is available through their published reports and media citations. Put those 2 documents next to each other. Look at the dates. Look at the enforcement announcements. Then look at the export volumes in the months that follow each announcement. If you find a consistent pattern where export volumes decline meaningfully and durably following enforcement actions, the argument in this analysis is wrong. If you find that export volumes are stable or rising despite the enforcement actions, the argument holds. That is the empirical test. Run it yourself, and if the data shows something different from what has been argued here, prove it wrong in the comments. That challenge is genuine. The analysis from this community is sharper than anything offered alone. Who actually holds leverage in a world where the most powerful nation on earth can announce the most comprehensive sanctions in history, and 43 tankers full of the sanctioned country's oil sail away the next morning in full daylight. Is leverage still a function of power, or has it become a function of dependency? And if the answer is dependency, who in this architecture is the most dependent on whom? I will see you in the next one.